You know the date. July 28th, 1794, 4:30 in the afternoon, Place de la Révolution. The crowd roars as the executioner lifts Maximilien Robespierre's severed head by its hair. 15 minutes of uproarious applause. Blood pools on the scaffold where the architect of the Reign of Terror finally met his end. But here's what nobody talks about. What happened next? The 24 hours that followed that blade dropping? The power vacuum that opened like a wound in the heart of revolutionary France? Because while everyone knows Robespierre died, almost nobody knows what happened in the immediate aftermath. The scramble for control, the mass executions that followed, the prisons that emptied overnight, the political machine that collapsed in hours, the panic in the streets, the complete reversal of everything France had become under his rule. This isn't the story of how Robespierre fell. This is the story of what France became the moment he hit the ground. If you value documented revolutionary history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Colin Jones's hour-by-hour analysis, The Fall of Robespierre, published by Oxford University Press in 2021, and archival records from the Thermidorian Convention documented in the World History Encyclopedia's analysis, published November 30th, 2022. Now back to the information. The blade falls at 4:30. Robespierre's body hits the scaffold, but the killing doesn't stop. 21 of his closest allies die alongside him. Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, the 26-year-old who called himself the Angel of Death, Georges Couthon, paralyzed from the waist down but deadly with his words, François Henriot, commander of the Paris National Guard who tried to save them all, Jean-Baptiste Fleuriot-Lescaut, mayor of Paris. Each head falls to thunderous applause from the crowd of thousands packed into the Place de la Révolution. But here's what the history books skip. The convention isn't done. Not even close. 5 hours later, 9:30 at night. The same day, July 28th, 1794, darkness falls over Paris, but the convention is still in session, and they're about to unleash something that makes Robespierre's execution look like the opening act. The decree comes down. 70 members of the Paris Commune who stayed loyal to Robespierre. Death, all of them, without trial. The largest mass execution ever carried out in Paris up to that point. These aren't aristocrats, or priests, or counter-revolutionaries. These are city officials. Municipal workers, clerks, and administrators who simply backed the wrong horse when the chips were down. July 29th, 6 in the morning. The carts roll again. 70 men who 24 hours earlier were running the day-to-day operations of revolutionary Paris. Now they're corpses in a mass grave. Their crime, loyalty to a man who was himself executed for crimes against the very revolution he'd helped create. But the purge is just beginning. The convention moves fast. Committee of Public Safety, stripped of power that same morning. For over a year, this 12-member body had been the effective government of France. They signed the death warrants. They directed the war effort. They controlled the Revolutionary Tribunal. They were the terror. Now they're just another committee answering to a national convention that's suddenly remembered it's supposed to be in charge. The change is immediate. July 29th, afternoon, the law of 22nd, Prairial, Robespierre's final gift to the revolution, gets repealed. This was the law that stripped defendants of legal counsel, that expanded the death penalty to anyone deemed an enemy of the people, that forced the Revolutionary Tribunal to either acquit completely or sentence to death. No middle ground, no mercy. Under this law, 1,400 people died in 6 weeks. The Great Terror, they called it, gone. In a single vote. But here's what's really happening in those first 24 hours. The machinery of terror hasn't stopped. It's just changed direction. The same national convention that cheered Robespierre's execution starts hunting down everyone who supported him. The same deputies who voted for the law of 22nd Prairial now denounce it as tyranny. The same politicians who signed death warrants by the hundreds now claim they were forced to do it. Antoine Fouquier-Tinville knows he's next, public prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal, the man who sent thousands to their deaths with his signature. He's been doing Robespierre's bidding for months, and now that Robespierre is dead, every death warrant with Fouquier-Tinville's name on it becomes evidence against him. He tries to flee Paris that first night. They catch him before dawn on July 29th. The prison's empty, but they fill right back up. Different prisoners now. Jacobins instead of aristocrats, Revolutionary Committee members instead of priests. The cells in La Force prison that held counter-revolutionaries yesterday hold pro-Robespierre militants today. The Conciergerie, where Marie Antoinette spent her final weeks, now houses former members of the Committee of Public Safety. Paris transforms overnight, literally. July 29th, 10 in the morning. shops that have been shuttered for months start reopening. Not because the owners feel safe, they don't, but because the price controls are gone. The maximum, Robespierre's economic policy that fixed bread prices and wages, dies with him. Merchants who've been hiding goods in cellars and warehouses bring them into the light. Prices skyrocket immediately. The sans-culottes, the working-class militants who were Robespierre's base, watch their world collapse. Bread that cost 14 sous on July 28th costs 35 sous on July 29th. Meat disappears from the markets entirely. The workshops that employed them at fixed wages shut down or slash pay. But the new regime doesn't care about the sans-culottes anymore. They backed Robespierre. They cheered his speeches about virtue and terror. They filled the galleries of the National Convention and intimidated deputies with their shouts and threats. Now they're the enemy. The Muscadins appear on July 30th. Groups of well-dressed young men with sticks and stones. They hunt down anyone wearing the red cap of liberty. Anyone with a Jacobin badge. Anyone who looks like they supported the terror. They call it the White Terror, and it's just getting started. But here's what's really extraordinary about those first 24 hours. The speed of the reversal. How fast everything Robespierre built crumbles. July 28th, evening. The Jacobin Club, the most powerful political organization in France, tries to hold an emergency meeting. They want to denounce Robespierre's execution as a conspiracy. They want to rally support for his ideas, even if they can't save the man himself. Nobody comes. The club that once had 500 affiliated branches across France, that once dictated policy to the National Convention, that once struck fear into the hearts of enemies of the revolution, empty. By July 30th, the convention votes to close it permanently and outlaw all its activities. The cult of the Supreme Being disappears even faster. Robespierre's attempt to create a new civic religion for France. The Festival of the Supreme Being on June 8th had drawn hundreds of thousands to the Champ de Mars. Robespierre himself led the procession, wearing a blue coat heavy with gold thread, climbing an artificial mountain to deliver his speech about virtue and the afterlife. July 29th. The altars get torn down, the ceremonial props get burned. The priests of the new religion, if they're smart, deny they ever participated. The revolutionary calendar still uses the name Thermidor for the month. But everything else about Robespierre's vision for a regenerated France dies with him. The foreign wars continue, but the domestic war against enemies of the revolution stops. July 29th afternoon, orders go out to the provinces. Stop the mass arrests. Stop the summary executions. Close down the revolutionary tribunals outside Paris. The representatives on mission who'd been enforcing the terror in the countryside. Recall them to the capital. Some resist. In Lyon, in Marseille, in Bordeaux, local Jacobin committees try to keep the terror going. They've built their power on purges and executions. They know that if the killing stops, they're finished. But Paris controls the purse strings and the military, and Paris has new priorities now. The change ripples outward from the capital, like shockwaves. July 30th. A courier reaches Nantes with orders to stop the mass drownings in the Loire River. Another reaches Arras, Robespierre's hometown, with orders to release political prisoners. A third reaches Toulon with orders to end the siege tribunals. But the reaction isn't just political, it's social, cultural. The whole texture of daily life in revolutionary France shifts. Theaters reopen, not the revolutionary dramas about virtue and sacrifice that played during the terror, but comedies, farces, light entertainment that helps people forget the horror of the past year. The Comédie Française, shuttered since January, announces it will resume performances on August 1st. Fashion changes overnight. The simple, austere clothing that marked a true revolutionary, the brown coat, the plain waistcoat, the unadorned hat, becomes dangerous to wear. You look like a Jacobin. You look like you supported the terror. So people start dressing up again. Bright colors return. Jewelry reappears. Hair powder comes back into style. Even the language shifts. Nobody talks about virtue anymore. Nobody denounces aristocratic conspiracies. Nobody calls for the punishment of enemies of the people. Those phrases, so common during the terror that they appeared in every speech and every newspaper, vanish from public discourse. Private conversations that would have gotten you guillotined on July 27th become acceptable on July 29th. Criticism of revolutionary policies, questions about the war effort, jokes about Jacobin leaders, the informants who filled the cafes and taverns. Listening for counter-revolutionary sentiment suddenly find themselves unemployed. But the most dramatic change happens to the Revolutionary Tribunal itself. July 29th, 11 in the morning, the public prosecutor is gone, arrested. The president is gone, fled the city. The jury members who condemned thousands to death, some arrested, some hiding, some desperately trying to prove they were forced to vote for execution. The trials stop, not gradually, immediately. The dockets that were full of cases on July 28th sit empty on July 29th. Defendants who expected to die find themselves released without explanation. Witnesses who came to testify against enemies of the revolution discover there's nobody left to hear their testimony. The Revolutionary Tribunal had been processing 60 to 80 cases per day during the Great Terror. Death sentences in the morning, executions in the afternoon, new prisoners brought in at night, a machine for killing that operated with industrial efficiency. July 29th, the machine stops. The executioner himself, Charles-Henri Sanson, finds his services suddenly less in demand. On July 26th, 52 people died. July 27th, 45 people died, enemies of Robespierre, as it turned out. July 28th, 22 people died, Robespierre and his inner circle. July 29th, 70 people died, supporters of Robespierre. But that's it. After July 30th, the daily executions that had terrorized Paris for over a year come to an end. Sanson, who had become the most feared man in France after Robespierre himself, suddenly finds himself unemployed. The economic impact hits immediately. July 29th evening. Food riots break out in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Working-class Parisians who could afford bread under the maximum discover they can't afford it at market prices. The same people who cheered Robespierre's speeches about equality watch their standard of living collapse overnight. But the new government doesn't care. The sans-culottes supported the terror. They intimidated the convention. They demanded revolutionary measures that hurt commerce and trade. Now, they're politically irrelevant, and their economic suffering is the price of ending revolutionary radicalism. Grain merchants who hid their stocks during the maximum flood the markets, not out of patriotism or concern for the hungry, but because they can finally sell at whatever price the market will bear. Bread prices triple, meat prices quadruple, wine becomes a luxury good again. The irony is impossible to miss. Robespierre claimed to govern in the name of the common people. His economic policies, however brutal in enforcement, kept food affordable for working-class families. His execution liberates the market but enslaves the poor. But economic freedom is exactly what the Thermidorians want. Paul Barras, one of the conspirators against Robespierre, owns property in the south. Jean-Lambert Tallien has commercial interests in Bordeaux. Joseph Fouché, despite his reputation for radical politics, knows which way the wind is blowing. These men didn't overthrow Robespierre to continue the terror under different leadership. They overthrew him to end the terror entirely and restore what they call normal government, which means government that protects property, not virtue. The foreign reaction starts filtering in by July 30th. Diplomats from neutral countries, Switzerland, Denmark. The German states had been watching the terror with fascination and horror. Would revolutionary France export its violent politics beyond its borders? Would other monarchies face similar uprisings? Robespierre's execution signals that revolutionary France is turning inward. The universal mission to spread liberty and equality to all mankind, replaced by practical concerns about trade and territory. The threat of revolutionary contagion diminished by the fall of its most charismatic spokesman. But inside France, nobody knows what comes next. The convention that voted to execute Robespierre includes many of the same men who voted to execute the king. The deputies who dismantled the Committee of Public Safety are the same ones who created it. The politicians who denounced the terror as excessive are the ones who implemented it. Institutional memory becomes a liability. Everyone who participated in revolutionary government over the past 2 years has blood on their hands. Everyone who voted for emergency measures, who signed arrest warrants, who approved military tribunals, who supported the maximum, they're all potential targets of the next purge. So they do what politicians always do in such situations. They blame the dead man. July 29th, afternoon session of the National Convention. Speaker after speaker rises to denounce Robespierre as a tyrant, a dictator, a man who betrayed the revolution for personal power. The same deputies who applauded his speeches about virtue now claim they always suspected his motives. The same politicians who voted for his policies now say they were intimidated into compliance. The historical record gets rewritten in real time. Robespierre, who always insisted he was just one member of a collective leadership, becomes solely responsible for every excess of the terror. The Committee of Public Safety, which made decisions by majority vote, becomes Robespierre's personal instrument of tyranny. The National Convention, which approved every major policy, becomes an innocent victim of Robespierre's manipulation. But the reality is more complicated. The terror wasn't one man's obsession. It was a system that involved thousands of people at every level of French society. Revolutionary committees in every neighborhood, surveillance networks in every workplace, informants in every cafe, bureaucrats processing denunciations, judges issuing warrants, guards making arrests, executioners carrying out sentences. All of these people. What happens to them after Robespierre dies? Some flee. Revolutionary Committee members who spent months investigating their neighbors for counter-revolutionary sympathies disappear from Paris overnight. They know that the same neighbors they investigated will be investigating them soon enough. Some switch sides. The most nimble politicians reinvent themselves as opponents of the terror who were forced to participate against their will. They produce letters, conveniently dated but never sent, expressing private doubts about revolutionary policies. They find witnesses, conveniently silent until now, to testify about their secret moderation. Some fight back. Die-hard Jacobins in the provinces refuse to accept that the revolution is over. They organize resistance cells. They plan uprisings. They try to keep the flame of revolutionary purity alive, even as the government in Paris abandons everything they believed in. But most just wait. They stay quiet, keep their heads down, hope the new regime forgets about their previous enthusiasm for revolutionary measures. They burned their Jacobin membership cards, hid their revolutionary pamphlets, and pretended they were never really supporters of Robespierre anyway. The psychological impact might be the most profound change of all. For over a year, France lived under a government that claimed moral certainty about everything. Robespierre and his allies didn't just have political opinions. They had direct access to the will of the people. The demands of virtue, the requirements of revolutionary purity. Dissent wasn't just opposition, it was treason. Criticism wasn't just disagreement, it was corruption. Moderation wasn't just a political position, it was complicity with enemies of the Republic. July 29th. That certainty evaporates, and the men who claim to speak for the people are dead or discredited. The policies implemented in the name of virtue are repealed as tyrannical. The revolution that promised to regenerate human nature through terror settles for the much more modest goal of stable government. The intellectual framework of the terror collapses along with its institutional structure. Nobody talks about revolutionary virtue anymore. Nobody claims that killing enemies of the people will purify society. Nobody argues that terror and virtue are inseparable. Instead, the new buzzwords are moderation, stability, and order. The very concepts that Robespierre denounced as counter-revolutionary become the foundation of post-Robespierrist politics. But there's a problem. France is still at war with most of Europe. French armies still occupy enemy territory. French generals still need supplies, reinforcements, and political support from Paris. The military situation that justified emergency measures hasn't changed just because Robespierre is dead. July 30th. Reports arrive from the Northern Front. The Austrian army is regrouping after their defeat at Fleurus. British gold is funding new coalition forces. Spanish troops are massing on the southern border. The external threats that Robespierre used to justify the terror are still very real. So the Thermidorians face an immediate dilemma. How do you wind down emergency government while fighting an emergency war? How do you restore normal politics while defending revolutionary gains against foreign invasion? How do you abandon the terror while keeping the military mobilization that the terror made possible? Their solution is pragmatic rather than ideological. Keep the war effort, drop the domestic repression, maintain conscription, abandon virtue, preserve military discipline, restore civil liberties. But this creates new tensions. The soldiers fighting on the frontiers enlisted to defend the revolution, not just the French state. They swore oaths to liberty, equality, and fraternity, not just to territorial integrity. If the revolution is over, what are they fighting for? The generals face similar questions. Men like Lazare Carnot, who organized the military effort under the Committee of Public Safety, find their positions precarious. They succeeded because they had dictatorial powers to commandeer resources and override local objections. Can they win without those powers? The early signs are mixed. French armies continue their advance in Belgium and the Rhineland. The Spanish frontier holds. The British naval blockade doesn't break French resistance. The military momentum created during the Terror carries over into the Thermidorian period. But underneath the surface, cracks appear. Supplies arrive more slowly because merchants aren't forced to sell to the army at fixed prices. Conscripts report more reluctantly because revolutionary fervor no longer compensates for military discipline. Officers worry about their political reliability as the definition of loyalty shifts. The foreign enemies of France watch these developments with interest. If revolutionary France is abandoning revolutionary ideology, perhaps accommodation is possible. If the terror is over, perhaps the threat of revolutionary contagion is diminished. If Robespierre's successors are more moderate, perhaps they can be negotiated with, but they're also cautious. The same convention that executed Robespierre still includes many radical deputies. The same army that fought for revolutionary principles still occupies enemy territory. The same republic that claims to represent the sovereignty of the people still rejects any return to monarchy. So the foreign powers adopt a wait-and-see approach. They continue military operations, but also send out diplomatic feelers. They prepare for both continued war and possible peace negotiations. They monitor events in Paris for signs of further moderation or renewed radicalism. Inside France, the regional variations become more pronounced after Robespierre's fall. Paris might have abandoned the terror, but not every part of the country gets the message immediately or wants to follow it. In the south, particularly around Lyon and Marseille, anti-Jacobin sentiment runs strong. These cities suffered brutal repression during the Federalist revolts of 1793. Local populations were massacred, buildings were destroyed, economies were ruined, all in the name of revolutionary unity. Now they want revenge. July 30th. Reports reach Paris of lynchings in the Rhone Valley. Former Jacobins dragged from their houses and beaten to death by mobs. Revolutionary committee members thrown into rivers. Anyone associated with the terror hunted down and murdered. This is the White Terror, the anti-revolutionary violence that follows the end of the Red Terror. It's not organized by the government in Paris. It's not part of any official policy. It's spontaneous popular vengeance by people who suffered under Jacobin rule and now see their chance for payback. But it creates a new problem for the Thermidorians. They wanted to end the terror, not start a different kind of terror going in the opposite direction. They wanted stability, not continued violence. They wanted reconciliation, not civil war between revolutionaries and anti-revolutionaries. Yet they have limited power to control events in the provinces. The same centralized authority that made the terror possible is what they're trying to dismantle. If they give Paris less power over local affairs, they can't prevent local affairs from spinning out of control. The paradox becomes apparent within days of Robespierre's execution. Ending tyranny requires using tyrannical methods. Restoring liberty means suppressing license. Creating stability demands crushing instability wherever it appears. So the Thermidorians find themselves in the awkward position of sending troops to protect former Jacobins from anti-Jacobin mobs. The same government that denounces Robespierre as a tyrant uses force to prevent his opponents from taking their own revenge. The economic consequences multiply as the days pass. July 30th. Assignats, revolutionary paper money backed by nationalized church property, lose value so quickly that merchants in some districts refuse to accept them. The financial system created to fund the war effort collapses as confidence in revolutionary government evaporates. Ironically, this helps the military situation in some ways. Soldiers who aren't paid in worthless paper money start paying themselves from enemy territory. Looting becomes systematic rather than opportunistic. French armies in occupied areas become self-supporting through plunder rather than dependent on supplies from Paris. But it also undermines military discipline. Officers who can't pay their troops can't control them. Generals who depend on local resources can't pursue strategic objectives that require leaving rich areas for poor ones. The army that fought for revolutionary principles starts fighting for personal profit. The social structure of revolutionary France begins reshuffling immediately after Robespierre's death. The sans-culottes, who dominated street politics during the Terror, find themselves marginalized. The middle-class professionals who kept quiet during the radical phase start asserting themselves. The property owners who fled during the land redistributions begin returning. But the most dramatic change affects the former nobility and clergy. Not the émigrés who fled the country, they're still banned from returning, but the nobles and priests who stayed in France kept quiet and survived the terror by keeping their heads down. Suddenly, they're not automatic enemies of the state. Their property, if it hasn't been sold already, might be returned to them. Their social connections, dormant during the radical period, become valuable again. Their expertise in law, administration, and diplomacy, dismissed as aristocratic corruption during the Terror, looks useful for stabilizing government. The Thermidorians need competent administrators more than they need revolutionary purity. They need people who understand finance, diplomacy, and military organization more than they need people who can give speeches about virtue. And the former nobles, whatever their political sins, often have the technical skills that revolutionary enthusiasm can't replace. So begins a cautious rehabilitation of the old elites, not a return to the ancien regime. That's still impossible. But an acceptance that some features of pre-revolutionary society might be compatible with post-revolutionary government. The intellectual climate changes just as dramatically as the political one. During the Terror, the only acceptable reading material was revolutionary pamphlets. Official decrees, acts, and reports of patriotic victories. Newspapers that deviated from the official line were shut down. Books that questioned revolutionary principles were banned. Even fiction had to serve revolutionary purposes. July 29th. The censorship apparatus starts collapsing. Not because the government formally abolishes it, but because the censors themselves are afraid of being denounced as supporters of the terror. Publications that would have been suppressed a week ago appear on the streets of Paris. Some are anti-Jacobin propaganda denouncing the excesses of the terror. Others are royalist publications testing whether monarchist sentiment can be expressed openly. Still others are simply non-political entertainment, novels, poetry, humor, that had no place in a society dedicated to revolutionary transformation. The effect is immediate and dramatic. Parisians, who lived for over a year in an intellectual straitjacket, suddenly have access to a diversity of ideas and opinions. The unanimity of the terror gives way to the cacophony of free expression. But this creates new anxieties for the government. How much dissent can be tolerated without undermining political stability? How much criticism of revolutionary policies can be allowed without encouraging counter-revolution? How much freedom of expression can be permitted without creating chaos? The Thermidorians don't have clear answers to these questions. They know they want to end the intellectual uniformity of the terror, but they don't know what should replace it. They know they want more open debate, but they don't know how to prevent that debate from becoming destructive. So they improvise. They allow criticism of Robespierre while suppressing criticism of the Republic. They permit discussion of past mistakes while forbidding calls for restoration of monarchy. They encourage intellectual freedom while maintaining political limits. It's an unstable compromise that satisfies nobody completely but provides breathing room for everyone. Former supporters of the terror can criticize Robespierre to prove their independence. Moderate Republicans can advocate for constitutional government without being denounced as counter-revolutionaries. Even royalist sympathizers can express their views indirectly through historical parallels and literary allegories. The cultural impact spreads beyond politics. Music, art, theater, fashion, all the forms of expression that were subordinated to revolutionary purposes during the terror start asserting their independence. July 30th. The Théâtre de la République announced a production of Molière's Le Misanthrope, a comedy about a man whose rigid morality makes him impossible to live with. Nobody needs to explain the contemporary relevance. Artists who painted portraits of Marat and Robespierre during the terror start painting landscapes and still lifes. Musicians who composed revolutionary hymns start writing dance music and love songs. Writers who produced patriotic dramas start working on historical novels and pastoral poetry. The revolution had demanded that all cultural expression serve political purposes. Every play had to teach Republican virtue. Every painting had to inspire patriotic sentiment. Every song had to strengthen revolutionary resolve. Robespierre's death liberates French culture from this political straitjacket. Not completely. The government still has opinions about what art should do, but the iron connection between cultural expression and revolutionary ideology breaks. For artists and intellectuals, this is tremendously liberating. For politicians worried about social stability, it's potentially dangerous. If cultural expression becomes independent of political control, how can political control be maintained at all? The question becomes urgent as the White Terror spreads beyond the original centers in Lyon and Marseille. August 1st, just 4 days after Robespierre's execution, reports arrive in Paris of anti-Jacobin violence in Nîmes, Avignon, and Orange. Former revolutionaries are being hunted down and killed by vengeful crowds. Some of these crowds include returned émigrés who slipped back into France during the chaos following Robespierre's fall. Some include deserters from the Republican armies who fled, rather than fight for a revolution they never supported. Some are just local people settling personal scores under the cover of political retribution. The Thermidorian government faces a terrible choice. They can use military force to stop the White Terror, but that requires the same kind of centralized authority they criticized under Robespierre. Or they can let the violence run its course, but that means abandoning their responsibility to maintain order and protect citizens. They choose a middle path that satisfies nobody. Military intervention in the most extreme cases, but general tolerance for spontaneous expressions of anti-Jacobin sentiment. The result is continued violence in the provinces, continued instability throughout the Republic, and continued uncertainty about the direction of post-revolutionary France. The dust has barely settled in the Place de la Révolution, and Robespierre's blood is not yet dry on the scaffold's timber. But France does not breathe a sigh of relief. It breathes a different air. An air of vengeance, of opportunism, and of a chaos that takes on a new form. The revolution is not over. It merely devours a new set of its children. The government that emerges from the ashes of the terror is not a government of idealists. It is a cabal of survivors, men like Paul Barras, an aristocrat turned revolutionary, and Jean-Lambert Tallien, whose mistress, Teresa Cabarrus, spurred him to overthrow Robespierre to save her own life. They do not speak of virtue. They speak of order. They do not seek the regeneration of mankind. They seek the protection of property and the consolidation of power. Their salons closed during the height of Jacobinism, reopen with extravagant parties while bread vanishes from the tables of Paris. The austerity of the incorruptible is replaced by the ostentation of the corrupt. They need enforcers, but not official ones. The streets of Paris, once patrolled by the sans-culottes militants, now belong to a new faction, the jeunesse dorée, the gilded youth. They are the sons of wealthy bourgeois, of financiers, of speculators. They dress in square-cut coats, exaggerated cravats, and wear their hair in braids that fall over their shoulders, mocking the short hair of the revolutionaries. They do not carry pikes, but leaded cudgels, which they call the executive power. They hunt Jacobins in the streets. They invade cafes known to be radical meeting spots. They interrupt theater plays they deem too patriotic, demanding reactionary anthems. The violence does not cease. It merely changes hands. The red terror of the Jacobins is met with the white terror of the Muscadins. The economy, which was Castillo, freed from the price controls of the maximum post-tact, collapses. The assignat, the revolutionary paper money, loses value with every passing hour. In August of 1794, a 100 livre assignat is worth 34 livres in coin. By October, it is worth 24. By winter, it will be worth less than 20. Farmers refuse to sell their grain for worthless paper. The result is famine, a famine more severe than the one that helped bring down the monarchy 5 years earlier. The bread lines return, longer and more desperate than ever. The revolt that follows? In the spring of 1795, known as the Prairial Uprising, is the last great convulsion of the sans-culottes. They invade the National Convention, demanding bread and the Constitution of '93. The Thermidorian government's response is not negotiation, it is repression. 20,000 soldiers are called in to crush the uprising. Thousands are arrested. 36 are executed. The backbone of the Parisian popular movement is broken forever. But how do the new masters of France justify this reversal? How can men who supported the terror suddenly become its greatest detractors? They need scapegoats, and they find a perfect one in Jean-Baptiste Carrier, the representative on mission in Nantes, the man who, to crush the counter-revolution in the Vendée, invented the noyades, the mass drownings. He would tie hundreds of prisoners, priests, women, children onto barges with false bottoms and sink them in the Loire River, calling it the National Bathtub. Carrier's trial, in the autumn of 1794, becomes a national spectacle. For the first time, the most sordid details of the terror are publicly exposed. Witnesses describe the bodies floating in the river, the summary executions, the systematic cruelty. The convention listens in feigned horror. Many of the men judging Carrier signed the decrees that gave him his power, but by condemning him to the guillotine in December, they perform an act of political purification. The terror, they declare, was not the result of revolutionary policy. It was the work of a few isolated monsters, like Robespierre, like Carrier. By executing them, the convention washes the blood from its own hands. While Paris writhes in political chaos and starvation, the armies of France continue to fight on the frontiers. And they are winning. Without Robespierre, without the Committee of Public Safety dictating strategy, the generals gain a new autonomy. They are less ideological, more pragmatic. Men who understand that the loyalty of their soldiers depends less on revolutionary pamphlets and more on victories, plunder, and regular pay. The army, once the instrument of the revolution, begins to become an entity of its own, with its own interests and its own leaders. A young artillery general, briefly arrested after Robespierre's fall for his Jacobin connections, is released for lack of evidence. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. He observes the weakness and corruption of the government in Paris and understands that the future of France will not be decided in debating halls, but on battlefields. France, 1 year after Robespierre's death, is an unrecognizable nation. The promise of equality has given way to glaring inequality, with the new elite feasting while the poor starve. The promise of civic virtue has been replaced by rampant cynicism and corruption. The promise of a government by the people has been crushed by military repression. The revolutionary pendulum has swung from one extreme to the other, from the tyranny of virtue to the tyranny of vice. Robespierre's fall did not end the revolution. It only opened its next, and perhaps most dangerous, chapter. A chapter that would ultimately lead not to a republic of citizens, but to an empire ruled by a soldier. The order the Thermidorians so craved would come, but not at their hands. It would arrive on horseback, wielding a sword.